Hello, this is Curtis with Pragmatic Agile, and I'd like to talk about a subject that I got a request for from one of my former colleagues. I need to help my team to slice their stories, and I'm struggling to get them to understand why they need to do that and how to do that. What is vertical slicing? What does that mean? Why do we even bother with vertical slicing? How to apply invest criteria to vertical slices, and what in the world does invest stand for? And as part of that, I'll also be talking about some of the pitfalls or anti-patterns that you can see, and we'll model that out. All right, so let's start off with what in the world is this thing called vertical slicing? It's not that complicated. It's just most developers have been taught to develop software in a certain way. Vertical slicing kind of turns that on its side. So it's a little bit counterintuitive at first. Once you get it into your head, then you're like, oh, this totally makes sense. Let's look at a real world bit of functionality and see if we can help guide the concept, just the basic concept of what does vertical slicing mean. All right. You've seen this before. Anybody who's booked a flight understands that there are several different flight softwares available out there. If this was the first time you were going to build this software, it did not exist anywhere in the world, but you had somebody, a product owner came in and created this diagram and said, this is what we're thinking about doing. And they might come in and talk to you and say, look, we want to create a single location where you can book flights and get all of the results back from all of the airlines that match the criteria you give. And additionally, we want to be able to do stays, right? We want to be able to add hotels and the flights, rental cars. We should be able to look at packages. Maybe even we can do cruises. That's our great view. That's where we're going to go. And at some point, somebody says, wow, that is a lot of functionality. That's a huge project. All right, so what is your minimal viable product? What's the minimum thing that we're going to start with and try and get out to a user group that would test our hypothesis? And the product owner says, well, it's definitely the ability to search on flights. The very first slice is at this big initiative level or this big product level. We're going to say, let's just identify what MVP is. Well, what's the functionality that goes in there? In other words, what can I take out? So what does it mean then? All right, we're going to slice it down to MVP. Well, it's a beginning to say, what are we going to take out of this grouping? And we'll keep some functionality, but we'll set other stuff up. So how about we're not going to do hotels at first. So I'm going to X that out. We're only going to focus on flights. So how about car rentals? No, take that out. How about packages? Well, of course not. Other things to do? No. How about cruises? No. Those will all come later on. Okay, great. Now, if you look at just the flights, let's talk about all the permutations of functionality that you have to do. And when we talk about the minimal viable product, we have to ask, who is our target audience first? Who do we think is most likely to use our software? And the answer is, we're thinking business class types of people. So here we go. So let's look at what types of flights are we going to support in the very first version. Well, round trip makes sense, right? So we have to have a round trip. How about one way? Maybe. How about multi-city? Probably not. All right. Let's take that one out. Let's simplify it. We're already beginning to slice. We're taking out functionality that can be postponed, deferred until later. Well, since we said our user persona is business, business is in. Premium economy is in. First class? Maybe. All right. Well, how about economy then? We could take it out, but the effort to add it is so small, let's just leave it. All right, so let's do all four of these. Okay, great. How about carriers? Do we have to build all the APIs for all the planes all at the same time for the first release? No, we just need to do probably just one. Let's start with American Airlines. Oh, okay. American. And we can X out the others? Sure. Let's keep the rest of this stuff down here out of it for now. We'll come back and add them, but that way we can test our architecture and our hypothesis with one carrier. How about what types of passengers? Well, mostly just a single passenger. Might be a couple, but we don't need the children and all that kind of stuff because we're starting off with a business class and adults. Okay. So this is what you're seeing here is the beginning, the rudimentary slicing, but this is done at like a feature level. I'm starting to take out big chunks of functionality. But let's go on to answer the question, why bother with vertical slicing?
I don't understand why we need to spend so much time breaking features down into small stories. We spend a lot of time discussing how to convert the feature into stories, when we could just work on the feature itself and get that done in a few weeks. What is the benefit of story mapping and trying to create stories that are developed in a day or two?
Right. Welcome back. We had Angry Arnold over there kind of shouting at us about why do we have to slice? Yeah, sometimes your team members can get a little bit wigged out because it's a little bit challenging, but we can help them to get there. Don't worry about it. Try and grasp these concepts, and then it won't take very long, and they'll get it as well. Why do we need to slice? Why are we even concerned? For faster feedback, we need to make sure that we deliver small pieces of functionality over to our customer. Let them take a look at it because we have to verify they said that they want this thing. And sometimes what the customer says they want and what they actually need is not the same thing. And so we build it iteratively and incrementally to help them to look at it, say, oh, I like this. I don't like that. Oh, I forgot about this. We need to add something. Do we understand? Did we interpret correctly? The thing that they said, did we interpret it right? Or have they thought we were going in this direction and we ended up going in this direction? And that happens, right? Customers over here, we're over here, and you have to bring it back together. The longer that you stay apart without recognizing that you're going in different directions, the greater the distance is between what was wanted and what was delivered, and the greater the expense to bring it back together. All right, so the feedback loop is a way of preventing error, minimizing defects, and discovering incrementally and iteratively exactly what it is that the customer needs and wants. And like I said, sometimes they're discovering with you. This gives you a lot of flexibility and adaptability. Okay, when you're working with small stories, it's easier to change within priorities. You might discover something and then say, oh, maybe we shouldn't do the economy class seating after all. Maybe we can dump that and let's switch over to this other thing. And you begin to remove things that simplify the work, reduce the work so you can get more value out to the customer faster. Additionally, when you're working on slicing these stories, you're improving your collaboration. You're driving a conversation between the customer, the product owner, and the team. It also, slicing stories helps to create some motivation and progress tracking. If I say that I have 500 little pieces of functionality that go into something, and I'm treating it as a gigantic piece of scope, it's very difficult to see whether or not we're making any progress. If we're delivering small stories over and over again, every couple of days, every few days, we are actually seeing checkboxes on the stories as they get done. This one's working, that's working, that's working. It gives us the ability to plan adaptively in smaller pieces. It's easier to plan what I'm going to do over the next 24 hours than it is over the next week. It's easier to plan the next week than it is over the next 6 months. The smaller the functionality is, the fewer dependencies you have. So when you're working on little tiny pieces, you usually are able to contain the dependencies and the risks that are associated with it and get that little piece of code across. Okay? It also makes, in the case where you have to forecast a delivery, it's easier to accurately estimate small pieces of code than it is really big pieces of functionality. That's obvious, right? You can imagine that. If you had to estimate how long it would take you to build a birdhouse compared to how long it would take you to build by hand a house, most of you would sit there and go, I couldn't even come close to predicting how well I could build a house by myself. I don't have the skills. Imagine the first time that anybody had to build this website saying, we're going to go out and collect all the flight data of all the airlines so that you can go to one place and type in your criteria and get search results back for all those airlines. At first, that was probably daunting. That's never been done. We're not sure how long this will take. Okay, but if you said, if I built just one API out to one company, how long do you think that would take? Well, Probably not very long, a couple of weeks maybe. So you see how different it is when you look at it at different scales? And this helps to avoid people from getting overwhelmed with the size of the project. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So we slice it this way also to test our hypothesis, our theory about how to build it, about the architecture. That explains why we do it. We need to talk about the invest criteria. As we go to break down our backlog, why do we have to break it into pieces that meet invest? Since the Agile principles drive us toward this frequent completion of small pieces of working software, we deliver the software both iteratively, which means within every sprint, and incrementally, the combination, the accumulation of software over many sprints in a little bit larger grouping that might be a release. Maybe it is called an MVP. Right? So little pieces add up over time, but we try to deliver software every iteration so that we can measure progress and see how we're coming along. If you're doing Kanban, you don't have the iterations, but you're still trying to deliver software in small pieces. As we create the backlog, what we want to do is make sure that we are creating stories that meet invest for a reason. What this means is that the stories should be formulated in a way that maximizes the delivery of value in a short time period, and we don't end up writing a bunch of stories that have no value. First of all, they're independent. The stories should be independent. You don't want to create two stories that are dependent upon each other so that you can't complete story A until story B is done. So you want to make sure that you create them in a way in which you can create everything within story A and everything within story B. And they're not dependent upon each other. You don't want it to get blocked in the middle of the sprint. Negotiable. That means that the product owner needs to be willing to talk with the team, all right, discuss and negotiate with the team so that they can say, look, I see what you want, but that's too big to fit within a sprint. So what we're going to do is we're going to slice it this way and deliver it in small pieces. The point is they negotiate. And this is a guidance to the product owner is, hey, don't be so inflexible that you don't allow the team to slice that into small pieces so that it's delivered sprint over sprint. The next thing is it should be valuable. But I've seen teams create these stories that are really not valuable to the customer. And so these need to be little pieces of working software that is part of the solution and it's valuable. It needs to be estimatable. It's not unusual. You see a story come to the team and they start to talk about how to implement it and they say, well, this might be a 3 or it might be a 20. When you hear that back and forth and they can't even size it, that tells you don't have enough information to size it. It's not estimatable, which means it's probably not ready for the team to work. So the next thing is that it needs to be sized appropriately. What that means is if you have a 2-week sprint, the story has to be done within 2 weeks. But even within a sprint, is it optimal to have stories that you might get done in a sprint? Oh, it'll take us 8 days. Well, it's a 10-day sprint. If anything happens, you're not going to get it done. So we also try and encourage you, keep them small, like every two days, a day to 3 days maximum. You can get that thing done. Optimally, a day or 2. Okay, so make it small. And then the last thing is it's testable. And again, this is one of those moments where I've had teams who will say, I'm not even sure how I could test this. You say to make it fast. Well, what is fast? How fast is fast enough? Do I need to reduce it to a 3-second page return? Or is it 13-second page return? Or they say, make it user-friendly. Well, what does that mean exactly? The testable phrase means that it needs to be specific and testable, concrete. Okay? You have to know when you've achieved that. So page rendering time must be less than 8 seconds. If you hit 7 seconds, you're done. Okay, so now let's get to the vertical slicing part of this. Okay, what does this mean? What it means is that when you're creating software, especially web software, you have multiple layers of the architecture. You have the user interface, all right? User interface, that's this thing right here that we're looking at when we go to use a web page. And then below that, you have a business logic layer. And then you have your service and API layers. And then you've got a data layer, right? Your databases. In vertical slicing, what we do is we say we're going to take a thin slice through the architecture. We're going to create one flight search for just a one-way trip We're going to create, it's limited to one city of origination and destination, like Miami to Tampa, only one airline, only one way. And when we write it, we want to make sure that we have a small interface functionality that allows you to do that, a small business logic layer, and a little service. Maybe you're only doing one API out. And by the way, you could stub out the API. You don't have to do the whole API. That means you could create an automated response. So you may not actually hit American Airlines. All you did was you validated that all of this part worked. And then as soon as you can harness it up to the real API, to the real customer, then you can do that. So that's possible. That's, again, a very thin slice. And then if you had to store that data in your data layer, then you store that little bit of data. And every sprint, you add on a little bit more and a little bit more. Now, I want you to notice that one of the benefits of this is, as you're working on that story, if you make a mistake, look at the little defects. The defects are found in this sprint, and then they're remedied in that sprint. This is one of the benefits of doing vertical slices. You're testing the whole architecture, you're finding defects in small pieces and fixing them, and then going on to the next piece, and you're adding that on afterward. So you notice that, yes, we did create 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 defects, but they were fixed within the sprint. So by the time you get done with all of this, it's all working. You will notice that over here, for example, I have perhaps some other non-functional types of tests or parts of definition of done, which I have deferred until later. For example, running automated test suites or user acceptance testing or security, that kind of stuff can be split out and deferred until later. That way, every one of your stories is small and you achieve your definition of done in each one of the sprints. There's a holding cost for defects. The sooner you find the defects and the sooner you fix it, the less expensive and the less difficult it is. So when you find it and fix it in a sprint, it has a little tiny cost. If it gets out of your sprint and you find it in your integration environment, it gets more expensive, a little bit more, because now it's connected to other things. So fixing that one defect might mean a cascading effect across other code modules. Once it gets out to staging, now it can become much more complex to fix. And if it gets out to production, now you have a serious problem, because now you got to roll back production, then you got to go and fix it and push it all the way through the environments and test it at every level and then push it back out again. We try to find defects early on, and vertical slicing helps us to test functioning code in a way that if there's a defect, we find it early and we fix it. Now watch what happens. Here's what I call Agile fault. Okay, this is a process that some companies will attempt to do, right, when they don't know how to slice properly. Let me get this set up. So this is where they try to horizontally slice, but they do it by process steps. Let me see. The exact same interface, business logic, service layer, data layer. All right. But what if we're going to do the design and everything in one sprint, and then we're going to do the development in the next sprint, and then we finally start to test it in the next sprint. Uh-oh. All right, so we're 3 sprints in it, and now we're finding the tests. And in this area right here, this is where you often hear developers say, well, development is done. No, it's not done until it's developed, tested, and approved. Okay? And in this case, you didn't discover the defects until the next sprint. So while you had planned on deploying it in this sprint, you can't. Now you have to go back and redevelop and fix. Okay. So this is where some companies will try and do like a mini waterfall. So you don't have a development sprint and a testing sprint. We don't do that. So the other anti-pattern is horizontal slicing by architectural component. This is very common too. So what you'll see some teams do is they say, okay, we're going to work on just the UI portion in this sprint. So they create a wireframe and it looks like this, but there's no functionality. Nothing works behind it. They just created a little UI. Okay. Is that working software? No. It's static software. Doesn't meet our principles, doesn't meet our invest criteria. Now, then the next one, they say, okay, now let's build the business logic layer. So then they create whatever logic rules are in there. Is it still working? No. 2 sprints in, we have pieces of software now, but they're not working together. It's just little pieces. And so we can't even test whether or not there's any functionality. Now, I'm assuming that they found this defect in this sprint, but sometimes they won't. because until you have all of these pieces wired up, you can't actually test that it's working properly. So even though this is showing right here, we're going to show this as a ghost. All right, this little defect right here is a ghost defect that's going to be discovered as soon as we harness it all up. So then they go and they create the data layer. And again, there's a defect there that is going to get introduced, but we're not going to be aware of it until we wire it all together. Now they create the service and API layer, and it goes out to the airline, and it comes back with the responses. And now you realize, bam, 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 we got all these defects, and we can't release on time. So what you've done is horizontal slicing by each layer of the architecture, and you've done one part in one sprint, one part in another sprint. I've seen teams that do this, and I couldn't get them to vertically slice until they spent, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 sprints working on something, only to discover that their whole theory was wrong, and they had to go back and redo it. And boy, was the CTO unhappy. But it's because they weren't doing thin slices and testing their hypothesis all the way through it. This is an anti-pattern. Don't do it. What you're looking for is this little beauty. Little thin slice of functionality every sprint all the way through the architecture. That's as short as I could possibly make it. Hopefully it's helpful. Let me know. Put some comments in there. Tell me if you'd like to have me clarify anything. All right? In the meantime, thank you very much and goodbye.